Hello to everyone in attendance here at the Campbell Conference Facility at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. And hello to our attendees online. Welcome to the 19th Annual Vladimir Dylynsky Memorial Lecture. This event has been organized by the Toronto office of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, University of Alberta, in cooperation with the Petro Yatsik Program for the Study of Ukraine and the Center for European and Eurasian Studies, University of Toronto. I am Tanya Plavushchak-Stech. I am the managing editor of scholarly publications at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, or CIUS, and I have the pleasure and honor of chairing today's event in my capacity as coordinator of the CIUS Dylynsky Lecture Series. I would like to extend a warm welcome to Miron Dylynsky and Olena Hrabovecka-Dylynsky, who unfortunately couldn't make it tonight, who are the generous supporters of this lecture series. Miron Dylynsky is in the front. Since 2006, the Volodymyr Dylynsky Lecture Series has featured prominent specialists in the history of 20th century Ukraine or in the affairs of independent Ukraine. This year's lecture, the 19th in the series, is again dedicated to a very timely topic relating to the Russian Federation's current war against Ukraine. The title of the Volodymyr Dylynsky Memorial Lecture this year, 2025, is Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the breakup of the liberal world order. So what is this lecture about? To answer, I will revisit our event description. Our distinguished guest, Professor Lucan Way, will explain how Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 challenged long-held assumptions about the nature of the liberal world order. Many consistently believed that the West could transform illiberal states, through economic integration. Increased trade and closer political ties with the West were expected to result in the diffusion of democracy and global peace. Such ideas partly motivated an active effort to open up the European economy to Russia in the 1990s. But in fact, this policy made Western states vulnerable to authoritarianism. Instead of the diffusion of democracy from West to East, the result was the spread of authoritarianism from East to West. Integration and the ease with which Vladimir Putin corrupted the European elite facilitated both the rise of populism and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I will add from myself a few words of reflection on the topic, pointing to trends that I have observed in media reports. We seem to be witnessing in real time a push by the Russian Federation for this type of economic integration, and a stubborn unwillingness on the part of the West to sound the alarm on the dangers of this. In particular, its potential for underpinning authoritarian shifts. For instance, on November 25th, 2025 at 7:45 a.m., CNN television was reporting on the quote-unquote United States peace plan for Ukraine, you know, the one that recently was allegedly prepared by Russia and handed to the US to present as their own. Well, one of the main points of the plan being reported by CNN was the condition that Russia is to rejoin the global economy. Why would Russia want this as a condition when one of its main policy trajectories shows itself to be imperialistic warmongering, whatever its direct or euphemistic way of expressing it or hiding it? On October 28th, 2025, at 6:33 p.m., Oleg Pawluk and Tatiana Olinik reported in Ukrainska Pravda that Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs Sergei Lavrov, at the third Minsk International Conference on Eurasian Security, was lamenting that EU leaders do not want Russia to guarantee peace for the EU and NATO together with them, but rather that they want to guarantee peace for the EU and NATO against Russia. Why was Lavrov publicly making a case for Russia to join the West in the provision of security guarantees when one of Russia's main policy trajectories has shown itself to be imperialistic warmongering? On October 30th, 2025, Dylynsky on MSN was reporting that Putin's special envoy Kirill Dmitriev, at an investment conference in Saudi Arabia, had signaled that closer cooperation between Russia, the United States, and Saudi Arabia, as mighty resource powers, could bring stability to global markets and reduce tensions. Why was Dmitriev publicly calling for economic cooperation with the US when one of Russia's main policy trajectories has shown itself to be imperialistic warmongering? A similar view on such a policy of integration can also be observed coming from the other side of the table. On November 4th, 2025, on the X platform, the handle Firing Line with Margaret Hoover posted a quote by Michael McFaul, who is a professor of political science at Stanford University, was US ambassador to Russia from 2012 to 2014, and together with Andriy Yermak, head of the Office of the President of Ukraine, heads the Yermak-McFaul expert group on Russian sanctions. McFaul said, quote, "Had Russia remained quasi-democratic and integrated into Europe, they could be one of the most important countries in the world right now. So Putin's autocracy at home and imperialism abroad has sent them back decades," unquote. And McFaul subsequently reposted this quote on his own handle on the X platform. So my reading of that quote is that McFaul is proposing the notion that Russia's increased economic integration into the West in the past would have quelled the beast, so to speak. Besides the financial and economic benefits, why would Russia enjoy the idea of reinserting itself more prominently into the global economy at this point? I would imagine that the Russian regime understands that this is also a fruitful avenue for the diffusion of its hardline ideas. At this event, Professor Lucan Way will help unpack this and other questions in wider context. Professor Way is Distinguished Professor of Democracy at the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto and a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. His research focuses on global patterns of democracy and dictatorship. He has published the books Revolution and Dictatorship, The Violent Origins of Durable Authoritarianism with Stephen Levitsky, Princeton University Press, 2022, Pluralism by Default, Weak Autocrats and the Rise of Competitive Politics, Johns Hopkins, 2015, and Competitive Authoritarianism, Hybrid Regimes After the Cold War, with Stephen Levitsky, Cambridge University Press, 2010. Professor Way's work on competitive authoritarianism has been cited more than 10,000 times and has helped stimulate broad research on the dynamics of hybrid democratic authoritarian rule. Thank you very much for your attention, and I now invite Professor Lucan Way to the podium.
Thank you so much. So to begin with, I want to take you back in time to a land far, far away. A world that seems so distant, but was so beautiful for those of us who were lucky enough to be alive. A liberal world order based on international cooperation and institutions promoting democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. Especially after the Cold War, many argued that economic and other forms of integration with the West would encourage the spread of political liberalism and democracy. Liberal transnationalists, including most famously Thomas Friedman, suggested that ties with Western democracies would encourage greater dependence on the democratic world and the spread of liberal ideas. These ideas underlay the European integration project, as well as Germany's policy of Ostpolitik in the 1970s, which was grounded on the idea that trade, diplomatic rapprochement, and person-to-person encounters would encourage peace and gradual political change on the other side of the Iron Curtain. A central part of such cooperation involved the gas trade, which exploded in the 1970s, figuratively, not literally. German dependence on Soviet gas increased from about nothing in 1970 to about 50% by the late 1980s. And many in Germany credit Ostpolitik with causing the end of the Cold War. Now, this is not a crazy idea, unless you think I'm crazy. Maybe you do, I don't know. Stephen Levitsky and I argued in 2010 that Western linkage, ties between particular countries in the United States and the EU, contributed to the democratization of during the post-Cold War era. The argument was the following. Basically, ties heighten the international reverberation of autocratic abuses, so the more closely tied, in terms of immigration, trade, and the like, there is between a country and the West, the more information about autocratic abuses seeps up to the West. Furthermore, such ties increase the number of domestic actors with a stake in adhering to democratic norms. That's the argument. It means that individuals and organizations with a strong interest in maintaining professional and other ties to the West have a clear reason to oppose autocracy in their own countries in order to maintain those ties. To quote a European official in the 1970s, you can never prevent an adventurer from trying to overthrow democracy if he is backed by banks and businesses. But once in the European community, you create a network of interests. As a result, those banks and businesses refuse to back the adventurer for fear of losing those links. So this is basically the logic of sort of linking, the fact of why sort of integration might lead to democracy. And indeed, we saw in the powerful and positive impact of liberal transnationalism in both Europe and Latin America in the 1990s. For example, the United States and American pressure encouraged businesses in the Dominican Republic to abandon the dictator Balaguer in the 1990s. As a result, the country democratized. Similarly, the expansion of the European Union into Eastern Europe helped transform the region from one totally dominated by closed autocracies in the 1980s to one in which even today democracies dominate. Perhaps the most stunning example of this transformation is in Romania, where the Romanian leader Ion Iliescu engaged in all sorts of abuse of power in the early 1990s, sending coal miners to beat up students and other abuses. However, the prospect of European integration forced Iliescu to cease pressure on the media and leave power in a clean election in 1996. So even a case like Romania, which suffered Stalinist rule until the late 1980s, became and continues today to be democratic. The ideas of liberal internationalism and a desire for commercial profit also encouraged Europe to integrate with Russia after the Cold War. And I think a lot of us, who are old enough remember, I remember going first to Paris, the Louvre, and seeing for the first time translations of museum guides in Russian, and it really felt like Russians were becoming part of the European community in a way that you had not seen before. Trade between Europe and Russia increased in the 1990s. Russian banks were also deeply integrated into the global financial system, and of course, Europe became significantly more dependent on Russian energy. Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, justified such integration as a process of change through trade. This is very much a sort of Ostpolitik idea. The idea that economic interdependence was expected to promote political moderation and stability. Such efforts at integration were also accompanied by a big dose of geopolitical accommodation. George H.W. Bush in 1991, of course, discouraged Russian-Ukrainian independence in the famous Chicken Kiev speech, and Bill Clinton after him ensured that Ukrainian nuclear weapons would be transferred to Russia or destroyed. Now, before we leave the liberal world order, I want to sort of remember the beauty of this idea, of this perspective. It's a focus on common human values. It says that all countries, all cultures can democratize. You can do good by doing well. I mean, this is a truly beautiful idea. And for a while, it really worked. I mean, I really think in the 1990s it worked. But the limits of liberal transnationalism is that, to an important extent, its success was rooted in Western economic and military dominance right after the Cold War. You had this unique period in the 1990s when a democratic West was really the only both military and economic power. But this was not to be long. Conditions changed in the early 21st century. You had first, the rise of China, which had started reform in the 1980s and grew in economic power by the early 21st century. And partly as a result, China has begun to take on a much more sort of forceful foreign policy, actively supporting African dictators, threatening Taiwan and the like. You also see Russia, basically the rise of Russia. Two things facilitated, increased Russian power. One was an economic recovery brought about by higher oil prices. In the 1990s, right, the Russian state was unable to pay pensions or state salaries. It was also brought about by the fact that, in the 1990s, Boris Yeltsin, the president, was drunk a lot of the time. He had significant heart problems. So there was a kind of vacuum of authority in the Kremlin. And simply, in addition to other things, Putin was a sentient president. So, that he was able to assert power. And this rise of Russia brought about a much more belligerent Russia. Putin in 2007 began to much more vociferously oppose NATO expansion in a way that it had not before. In 2007, Putin called NATO expansion a serious provocation. In 2008, Russia invaded Georgia. And in the 2010s, Russian actors began interventions in Western elections in Germany, France, and of course the United States in a way that it had never before. Finally, the rise of illiberal powers was accompanied by increasing signs of Western dysfunction. You had disastrous military interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan. You had debt crisis in the United States and Europe in the late 2000s. You had Brexit. So these new conditions, a weakened democratic West and an ascendant authoritarian East, altered, in my view, the impact of integration. First, in these new conditions, diffusion not only took place from West to East, which was the focus of my own work. Over the last decade, we've also seen diffusion taking place in both directions. In particular, Viktor Orban, pictured here, became an inspiration for many aspiring autocrats in the West, including Trump and the Republican Party in the United States, because this was a guy who was democratically elected in a consolidated democracy, relatively wealthy, right? Hungary is high income, and he was basically able to impose authoritarianism. So this became a kind of model for autocrats in the West. So it wasn't just diffusion from West to East, it was clear evidence of diffusion from East to West. In particular, Trump administration borrowed the concept of the deep state discourse used by autocrats in Hungary as well as Turkey to justify politicization of the civil service in the United States. You see that right now going on with the prosecution of people like James Comey and other rivals of Trump right now in the United States. Integration has also hampered efforts to hold dictators accountable. Thus, the Orban government initially avoided EU censure by using his party's membership in the European People's Party to deflect criticism. So, Angela Merkel helped basically cover for Orban, right? Finally, Russia also dug its claws into portions of Russia also dug its claws into portions of the European elite, a phenomenon best exemplified by the former German Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder, who once called Putin a flawless Democrat. We also see, he on the board of Rosneft. We also have Putin's friendship with Berlusconi in Italy. Thus, integration has not only you also had this sort of Russian European dependence on Russian energy. Also created Russian leverage over Europe. It was able to threaten shutoffs if sanctions were applied. Thus, integration has not only spread democracy from west to east, which I think did happen in the 1990s. It has sometimes facilitated the diffusion of authoritarianism from east to west. It has also made it harder for Western actors to punish abuses by giving autocrats a seat at the decision-making table and by increasing the economic costs of sanctions. Okay, which brings us to Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which I think presented a clear challenge to core assumptions behind liberal internationalism. Now, some, of course, make what is in some ways the opposite argument, that the invasion was provoked by Western aggression and an unwillingness to take seriously Russia's so-called legitimate security concerns. I'm speaking, of course, about the expansion of NATO. And indeed, you look at this map and you kind of understand, it kind of feels like NATO is invading Russia, right? You see it's expanding, right, getting closer. And it kind of looks like NATO is trying to attack Russia. Now, one can never know, right, what actually caused the invasion. Power in Russia is highly centralized, and you can never know what's going on in one old guy's head, right? I mean, we don't know. He was isolated. He had all the power. He could choose to, invade or not. Who knows, right? But we can still make educated guesses based on his statements and other evidence. And indeed, the overwhelming evidence is that the invasion had nothing, and I say nothing, to do with NATO. First of all, the expansion of NATO was clearly, the expansion of NATO was clearly driven by countries' desire to defend against Russia, not attack Russia. Right? Furthermore, membership was, it's true that in 2008, the West promised NATO membership for Ukraine. But clearly, by 2021, membership was off the table. Russia's invasion in 2014 had already created territorial disputes that basically made it impossible for Ukraine to join NATO. And Russia knew this. I went through, tasks. You see evidence. The Russian state media, which is controlled by the government, says that, in 2021, argued that after 2008, Ukraine had moved away from membership. So there is no evidence. There's no evidence that Putin really thought that that Ukraine was about to join NATO. Furthermore, Putin accepted the expansion of NATO to non-Ukrainian countries like the Baltics, Finland, Sweden. In 2001, Putin stated in regards to Estonia and the Baltics that Russia cannot forbid certain choices if they want to increase their security in a particular way. So clearly, Putin, rightly did not see NATO as a threat, because no serious scholar has ever suggested that NATO was about to invade Russia. That is complete bunk. I think that's a technical term. bunk. It's a political science term. You've heard it here first. Okay. Furthermore, don't get me started. Logic, right? If you're concerned about NATO, why do the exact thing that NATO was created, the raison d'etre for NATO, right? And indeed, very predictably, the invasion dramatically increased Ukrainian support for NATO. So before the 2014 invasion, I never thought Ukraine would join NATO because I don't know what the exact polls were, but different polls. But basically, they showed that 45% of Ukrainians supported NATO. Now it's up to 80% for reasons that are completely obvious. So he had to have known this. Okay. So there are many reasons why he invaded. I think, first had to do with Russian imperialism, as Putin famously said in a speech right before the invasion, that Ukraine is an inalienable part of Russian history, culture, and spiritual space. And anybody who spent time in Russia knows most Russians think of Ukraine as part of Russia. I don't think that this made necessarily the invasion inevitable, but I think it was certainly driven to an important extent by Russian imperialism. I think it's undeniable. Furthermore, there were conflicts with Zelensky, between Putin and Zelensky, including Zelensky's treatment of Putin's best friend, Viktor Medvedchuk, who's seen here under arrest. How do we know that Viktor Medvedchuk was Putin's best friend? How do we know that? Well, I talk to Putin all the time, he tells me. No, because Putin was obviously, as you know here, during COVID, this is how he normally interacted with people. But we had during COVID pictures of Medvedchuk and Putin sitting right next to each other. So he clearly was best friends with him, which I think makes it plausible, at least that sort of the conflicts. Zelensky's rightfully called Medvedchuk a traitor, pro-Russian force within Ukraine, but this I think sort of set Putin off. Finally, I think there was this Russian assumption of of weakness both on part of Ukraine but also the West. As I said before, you had European divisions over Russia, a very weak response to the invasion of Crimea, where there was sort of basically a slap on the wrist. Germany agreed to sort of continue Nord Stream 2. You also had the failure to bring Ukraine into NATO, as well as in the summer of 2021, Biden's disastrous pullout of Afghanistan. So this, I think, encouraged the belief that the invasion would not be seriously resisted by the West. So why did Putin invade? Because he could. He felt like he could invade, right? I think that, Now, in fact, what you saw was, thankfully, a much more robust Western response than Putin or, other people expected. Above all, there was I just want to emphasize, the Ukrainians really rallied, united, and fought off Russians. That's the most important thing. But you also saw a real attempt by Western European powers on, in a financial shock and awe. Russian banks were taken out of SWIFT. Hundreds of companies left Russia. Over 1,000 initially, at least, curtailed operations. You had tremendous amount of weapons given to Ukraine by the West, and so Ukrainian resistance and Western support for that resistance was much stronger than many people had predicted. Not everyone. You also saw the sort of end to sort of liberal transnationalism. This was really a rejection of Ostpolitik. Frank Steinmeier, the president of Germany and the SDP member, referred to this as an epochal break in Russian-German ties. Our countries are standing against each other today. So this really caused, I think, a shift in the attitudes of many Western policymakers, except, of course, for Angela Merkel, who somehow, in her latest memoirs, still blames the West for Russia's invasion, which is, crazy. Seriously. Anyway, okay. So if liberal internationalism is dead, what is replacing it. So the first is clearly elements of what in the post-war era we called containment. This was based on a belief that Russia, the U.S. Soviet Union, was inherently expansionist, and there was a focus on protecting the democratic West against Russian and Soviet expansion. And we definitely see evidence of this. So the reversal of these policies about integration, decreased dependence on Russian energy. We have increased European defense spending, increased a bit. There are plans to sort of have defense spending go to the level of 3.5% of GDP or 5%. You also see the expansion of NATO to Finland and Sweden. So this is kind of clear evidence of a kind of new containment, which I personally think is a good thing. But there are real limits on European-led containment. For one, the most important thing is the military might of the U.S. dramatically outpaces that of Europe. Most of the military-industrial complex is just much stronger in Europe. Europe still relies on U.S. technology. All this at the same time when the U.S. has become an authoritarian state. This is what I write about in my other, I can talk to you. I'm happy to talk about that. Sad to talk about that. Anyways, the United States is clearly not committed to NATO. You have a breakdown in American democracy. So, which brings us to the other darker possibility, which is a kind of emergence of great power imperialism, an end to the rules-based international order, a focus on spheres of influence in which smaller countries have no say, and the prospect which really keeps me up at night, which is that the world's most powerful military, instead of countering Russian imperialism, will back it up. And we see this most recently with the 28-point plan, which was literally translated from Russian. I think it was Luke Harding who noted that some of the phraseology sounds really awkward in English, but in Russian, ожидается is expected that. Sounds much more fluid in Russian. Right? So it's clearly this was Trump's plan was obtained from a Russian translation of the Russian. Now sometimes many sort of IR scholars, Thomas Graham and others, have argued that this focus on spheres of influence is more realistic and responsible, that you shouldn't aggressively respond to Russia because you're risking Third World War, nuclear conflict, and the like. My perspective is the opposite. For one, it is pointless to negotiate with Russia. Russia has already multiple times agreed to respect Ukraine's international border. Does the fourth or fifth time that it agrees, is that going to be the magic number? Give me a break, right? Instead, accommodation to Russian imperial demands is itself escalatory. That if military aggression and nuclear blackmail is rewarded, there will simply be more military aggression and nuclear blackmail. Right? If threats of nuclear war cause the West to put more limits on Ukraine, why would Russia stop making those threats? If Russia thinks it can engage in aggressive behavior with little cost, it will probably engage in more authoritarian, aggressive behavior. Essentially, a failure to push back against Russian aggression will encourage more Russian aggression. And I don't think it ends there. A lot of people focus on how accommodation encourages Putin, but it has much broader implications. Because if Russian irredentism is seen as successful, then other countries might be encouraged to realize their own imperialist fantasies and invade their neighbors. In particular, I'm thinking of China, which could be encouraged to invade Taiwan. All of this adds up to a much more violent international system. So, to sum up, I will reiterate a lesson that I've learned from decades of studying Russian and Eastern European politics, namely that as bad as things are now, they can always get worse. Sorry. Thank you. That is the end of that.
Thank you very much, Professor Lucan Way. I would like to open the floor, if possible, to questions from our attendees. Okay, we'll start here in the middle and we'll move to the side. Yes, please, in the sweater. Oh, and could you just say your name and...
Okay. Yeah, my name is Neville. Given the dire situation right now in the Ukraine and the fact that Ukraine had given up its nuclear weapons in the early 1990s, what do you think of someone in the West returning some of these nuclear weapons to Ukraine as a deterrent? Is that possible? Is that going to call Putin's bluff? What are your views about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I mean, what, you know, I remember, who was it? Oksana, there's an arms specialist came here, gave a talk a number of times a while ago about Ukraine's decision to give up its nuclear weapons in the 1990s, which basically it had no choice because otherwise it would have been an international pariah. Yeah, I mean, so clearly, you know, one option for Ukraine would be to build its own nuclear bomb. But I think that my guess is that that would be problematic, one, because it would easily be found out, at which point, you know, Russia would, you know, engage in aggressive behavior in Ukraine, and also probably then, almost certainly the West would cease to support Ukraine. I mean, I don't necessarily agree with this policy. I mean, I don't see why, for example, you know, France can't give a few of its bombs to Ukraine. I mean, I haven't heard a good answer. You know, I'm sure the sort of very serious people, the responsible policymakers in Europe would consider that irresponsible. I think what's going on now is pretty irresponsible. So, yeah.
Please, Alexandra.
Thank you, Alexandra Menko. Thank you so much for the insightful talk. So I will ask probably about the practical steps for us in Canada, about policy-based decision-making that we can try to make in the interest of Canada and Ukraine based on the new world order. So, and I will probably ask more about the defense technologies. So it looks like it's right now in our national interest here in Canada to collaborate with Ukraine on defense technologies. So how we can convince, and I think it's already on the table, the government of Canada, our Prime Minister, Minister of Defense, to really expand this collaboration with Ukraine. So our Prime Minister McCartney 2 months ago in Kyiv announced 220 million for joint ventures with Ukraine, and I'm sure it is going to be more, but we need, in my opinion, faster. We need to protect our Canadian Arctic, and the defense tech developed in Ukraine, including AI, robotic systems, drones, is really the game changer. So we know that in the future the wars will be fought by robots, not humans, is powered by AI. And as a specialist of AI myself, I see that that future is unavoidable. So if we don't do it, China will do it. So how we can influence policies of Canada to basically protect our national sovereignty by collaborating with Ukraine? Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think that's I like that question because it highlights the fact that Ukraine is not just, you know, needs support from the West, but actually is a source of technological innovation for the West. I mean, what, you know, whatever, sort of Russia, you know, facing an existential threat, like Russia has forced a kind of level of innovation in drone technology and the like, that I think, you know, has, you know, maybe useful to the West. And, you know, right now, Ukraine is quite clearly the most powerful army in Europe, right? I mean, the interesting from Russians' perspective is that they had it good in the 1990s. You had a relatively divided Ukraine. It was, you know, its military was quite weak. They have basically created a kind of Israel in terms of military power on its neighbor, which is, you know, and Russia has a very long border, right? This is not in any way in Russia's, you know, actual national interest. And so I think, you know, I think that's a good point, that there's a lot that Ukraine offers to us, not just that we can offer to Ukraine.
Monty McMurtry. Thank you. I remember that lecture very well when she opined that the only possibility that the bomb would be used by Russia if Russia was on the cusp of winning, analogous to America and Japan at the end of World War II. And that resonates, and I still believe that. But going back, I mean, Putin understands the sword of Damocles. He's in a very tough spot. He has very little choice to maneuver. Because do you believe that he cannot pull back because his personal power and privilege will very well be affected? Over 1 million casualties, Russia, very little to show, all things being equal. His choices are limited, and that becomes very apprehensive. What are your thoughts, sir?
I think Putin can do whatever he wants. I mean, this is a personal dictatorship. He has total room for maneuver. I mean, for a while after the invasion, people were talking about, give Putin an off-ramp. He does not need an off-ramp. He could have declared victory, after whatever, Mariupol. Oh my God, we got Mariupol, thank God, right? Declared victory. He could have gone home anytime he wants. So the idea that somehow, I mean, this reminds me of like the old thing, during negotiations between Stalin and Churchill, Stalin would say, I have to get agreement from the Central Committee, right? Everybody, he did not have to worry about getting agreement from the Central Committee. He could do whatever he wants. It's the same thing now. The problem is, in fact, I think many in the Russian elite did not want this war. I mean, the Russian oligarchs, the sanctions haven't halted Russian behavior, but it certainly made life harder for a lot of the Russian oligarchs who liked shopping in Paris. I mean, nice to shop in Paris, right? And so I think if he was actually constrained, he probably wouldn't have been necessarily invaded in the first place. So I think he has total room for maneuver. He just chooses not to.
Please, no, there's a question here on the edge, individual in the blue shirt.
Hello, Alex. So my question, could the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022 been avoided if the West was stronger in terms of a response in 2014?
That is a good question. So I actually have a friend who worked in the Obama administration, and he stayed at my house. And I remember during the time he was like, after the invasion of Crimea, that he was talking about the quote unquote crazies who are arguing for taking Russia off of SWIFT. And I said to him, Rory, what do you think now? And I think that was the moment that could have changed. He claims that the problem was the Europeans. It was the Schroeders of the world, the Berlusconis of the world that didn't want to do that for reasons I think I outlined in the talk. But I think you're absolutely right. What you saw was, Putin testing the waters, right? He violated the most core principle of the international system, which was invading another country and then annexing it, which is something that hasn't been done very often, since in the post-war era. And when it was done, like when Iraq invaded Kuwait, George H.W. Bush responded very aggressively, right? And so he does that in Crimea, and there are a few sanctions, but nothing basically happens. And so one has to wonder. Again, you never know what's going on in one old guy's head, right? So it's impossible to know for sure, but I think that is a very good question. I think that's very likely. I think, which is why Angela Merkel's perspective is just nuts. That's, again.
Ooh.
Can we just have the question of Professor Sisson, and then we'll move to the online questions.
Check, check.
In some ways, I'm much more hopeful about Hungary returning to liberal order than the U.S. And so I wonder, in your discussion of as Russia is moving and becoming more aggressive, where would you place the Trump first election? That is, with seeing the potential collapse of the liberal order, and obviously with all the Florida real estate deals and everything that had gone on, do you see that as a turning point as well, and that Russia could see I'm not saying he was prescient, but he knew he was going to be working on the U.S., and that first term of Trump may have been, I think, crucial in this change.
Yeah, I mean, I do think, I mean, the big issue, the big question is, the Republican Party's dramatic turnaround in its policy towards Russia, which was really driven by one man, which is Trump. And I never knew what was going on with Trump and Russia, the PP tapes, the sort of idea of blackmail. I mean, when it comes down to it, I think the most important thing is that Trump simply admires dictators. So I think it's much more kind of normative than any sort of kind of backroom deal. Trump's love of Putin, and I think that if that's what I'm not sure if that's your question, but what was, I mean, I think that is. I mean, in other words, that is what makes. I mean, you think of that's what makes sort of containment so kind of hard to kind of get your head around, because containment after World War II was led by a democratic West. But when the West itself, when the United States, the most powerful military itself, is anti-democratic, how, it's just hard to imagine what containment will consist of unless you just need to, it's going to takes a long time to build a military-industrial complex. And I think you're absolutely right. This is what we need to do here in Canada. But it's a monumental task. But it's going to take time. So
I'm going to give some voice to our online audience, and I would just for the sake of proper order, I will say that there was exactly the same question coming from one of our online viewers. Barbara Stewart said that I would argue that instead of 2022, the challenge began in 2014 when the invasion and occupation of Russia and no effectual response from the West. Could you please comment? You did comment, so we will go on. Yeah. But the next is the set of two questions. How does Orban's Hungary fit into your analysis? But then follow it up, what about the role of Global South, India, BRICS?
So two really good questions. First of all, I think what Orban shows, and this is something I tried to show in my talk, is the sort of double-edged nature of integration, which I don't think we fully appreciate, which is, I think in a context of liberal hegemony of the 1990s, when the West has total economic and military dominance, integration can and did spread democracy to places like Romania, where many thought democracy would never take hold. But what has happened instead also, which I think we should have seen, is the diffusion of ideas, again, from east to west. And I think here Orban's kind of evil brilliance, let me just talk to you about what I mean by his evil brilliance, which was we typically, before Orban, thought of authoritarianism as taking hold as a result of more kind of overt civil liberties violations. You lock up journalists, you shut down, television stations. But what's remarkable about Orban, he has done none of that. It's all through things like gerrymandering, backroom deals. So rather than sort of, how does he deal with opposition media? The Russian approach is you shoot the journalist, right? The Hungarian approach is you take a little bit longer time. Media has a hard time surviving in the market, so you give government advertising to the media that support you. And if the opposition media doesn't survive the market, they go bankrupt. Well, that's just the market, right? You then, so let me just give you the example of Origo, which was a news website, which in 2015 was the largest news website in Hungary. It was a source of a lot of criticism of Orban. So what did Orban do? He, first of all, he went to the owner of Origo, which is the website, Magyar Telekom, and said, lo and behold, your license renewal is coming up. Maybe you should change the editorial policy of Origo. Maybe that would help. And they tried that. Eventually, the Hungarian government forced Magyar Telekom to sell the website. And they actually had a completely open bid. The Hungarian government simply gave bank loans to one of the pro-Orban companies allowing it to take over Orgo. So now Orgo is like every other media outlet run by Orban allies, which is just totally pro-government. Right now in the United States, you're seeing something similar with the takeover of CBS by the Ellison family. I mean, this is really techniques that originated in Hungary and are quite literally right now in the United States spreading to the United States. I mean, basically, it's a sort of imposition of authoritarianism without the sort of without violence, essentially, but through backroom deals. But it's still authoritarian.
One more question from our online audience. Thank you, Professor Way. I'm concerned that the decisions about how the Ukraine conflict will be resolved is being taken away from the hands of Ukraine. What does that say about the shape of the world order and how other decisions might be handled?
Well, it's pointing, I think, to the kind of emergence of a kind of great power imperialism, which I think is highly concerning. And again, this is not simply about Ukraine, right? This is not simply about Europe. It's about whether we want to live in a world in which there are constant wars and invasions of one country and another. I mean, it is nice to live in a world where countries like Canada can focus not on its national defense, but on economic development. That's a good thing, right? And if you allow Russia to get away with invading Ukraine, you're opening up the Pandora's box to a much more violent, ugly global order. And this is where I really fundamentally disagree with some of the, quote, very serious IR scholars like Thomas Graham, Emma Ashford, and others, who sort of don't see Ukraine in the U.S.'s interests. I mean, I don't see how you could not see maintaining a world in which countries don't invade one another as not in the United States' interest. That seems insane to me.
Sorry, I will just return to one of the earlier questions. What about the Global South, India, BRICS?
So it's interesting. So my wife's family is from Pakistan. So I went there to Islamabad in March, and I gave a talk about Ukraine in Islamabad University. And it was shocking for the following reason. I mean, it wasn't that Pakistanis thought Russia had a point in the invasion. They had literally never heard of the argument that the invasion was driven by Russian imperialism. It was a total shock to them. They listened, it was all about NATO, which is insane because it's so clearly, I'm sorry, but the NATO argument is complete bunk. There's just no good evidence for it, even though it's kind of it kind of sound true, right? But it's not true at all. And so, I mean, in some ways that kind of made it easy. I was like, there's this thing called Russian imperialism. They're like, really? I said, yes. I told them all about it. And they're like, wow, thank you, Professor Way. So it goes to show you there's just a total lack of knowledge. But I think the question is, why does Putin's argument resonate so much with the Global South, even though it really makes no sense? I think it's because they don't know about Russia, Ukraine, but a lot of them are anti-American. And so I think it taps into something they know, which is anti-Americanism, right? And so I think that is probably what makes Putin so successful. But it also means that there has to be, I think there have been efforts, by a number of Ukrainian actors to really just inform the public in the Global South about this, because I think they just don't know.
Okay, if there are no questions from the floor, I will give another one from our online audience. Your thoughts on current Carney Ukraine-Russia policy?
I think, unfortunately, Canada is just Canada really needs to, it's very, Canada's situation is really akin to Ukraine in the sense that it faces a much larger, somewhat less aggressive power, but we really need to focus on building our own military-industrial complex. I think cooperation with Ukraine, but we both face the kind of similar challenges in a lot of ways, right?
Okay, we have another question in the front. Thank you.
Lucan,
Thank
great talk, Lucan. Ed Schatz, I'm the director of the Center for European and Eurasian Studies. here. So, Lucan and I go way back. So, I'm going to ask the question mostly. I know how you're going to answer, but I got to do it anyway. Okay. So I guess my question is: it feels like there are a bunch of moving parts here in your discussion of Trump and Putin, for example, and I'm trying to figure out. It seems like the sort of the main moving part is Putin's lifespan. That is really that's the game we're trying to play. We're trying to play the game of to the question of ratcheting up the defense spending to try to cooperate with Ukraine, basically have Ukraine hold out, because the only kind of peace deal, quote unquote, that can happen during Putin's lifetime is not an actual peace deal, right? I think that's consistent with what you were saying. Then I wonder what causal role Trump 2.0 actually plays in this story. Like, what difference does it make that Trump is in power? Obviously, it doesn't help things. It makes sort of an unjust outcome much more likely. But do the counterfactual with Kamala, in the White House. I know that's hard, but it was 11 months ago or something like that, 12 months ago, where we had this election. It's not that long ago. We can do the counterfactual. What difference would that make, or what would have had to happen for it to be significantly different? Or would we be trundling along just on more or less the same path, maybe less quickly towards disaster?
I actually think it would have made a monumental difference. I mean, I thought that Biden should be more aggressive. I think it was crazy for Biden to put constraints on Ukraine's use of long-range weapons. But what's going on right now is infinitely worse. I mean, Trump has a unique disregard for liberal international institutions. And so I think the impact of the T factor, of like contingency of having Trump as opposed to Kamala, is unbelievably enormous. I mean, I think, because the truth is, everybody, when you hear people like Leonid Rogozin or Thomas Graham or Emma Ashford talking about Russia, they talk as if Russia can't be defeated. That is simply wrong. U.S. military power is much greater than Russia's. We have just chosen not to because of things like, nuclear blackmail. And I think that's for reasons I outlined, a hugely irresponsible policy, because you're just encouraging more nuclear blackmail. And let's talk about nuclear blackmail for a second. There's obviously a non-zero chance that Russia could use nuclear weapons. Where do you think they're going to use nuclear weapons? Do you think they're going to use them in Brussels? No, they're going to use them in Ukraine. So it's Ukraine again that is bearing the brunt of the risk. And so for Biden and those guys to underutilize their power with regard to Russia, that is escalatory. The whole language around escalation was always that American or Western aggression will provoke Russia. Well, American or Western accommodation and weakness is equally provocative, escalatory. That is what it was the non-response to 2014 which escalated the conflict. So I think the whole kind of framing of that is hugely problematic. That weakness is escalatory. If I walk, to school and the bully says, "Can I have your lunch money?" And I say, "Sure. Here's my lunch money." Do you think they're going to do it tomorrow? Of course they're going to do it tomorrow. That's escalatory behavior. It's the same thing with, in 2014, right? This whole notion that, now everybody's talking about the, Ukrainian corruption scandal. That's finally going to get Zelensky to agree to a peace deal. Zelensky, to put it mildly, is not the obstacle to peace in the region. And by the way, no one asked me about the Ukrainian corruption scandal, but can I just say something? That shows you how powerful institutions are in Ukraine. So everybody's talking about, Zelensky's going, everybody's corrupt. Corruption is everywhere. That is, especially during war when there's all this money going to the defense industry. It's like every country that was at war had some kind of corruption. But not every country had an institution like the Anti-Corruption Committee, whatever it's called, that was able to resist it in the context of existential threat. So I think that, that, to me, I see, people are like, "Oh my God, Zelensky's so weak." I'm like, "Oh my God, Ukraine is so strong." That in the context of war, the institutions function. that they're able to sort of, expose corruption, put them through the courts. I mean, that tells me that Ukraine is a really healthy society. So, yeah. That really I got one question.
The in the back tan sweater.
Thank you so much. And first of all, I just appreciate all this presentation today. I appreciate your support for Ukraine as a Ukrainian myself. And we mentioned how Western action was very weak in 2014, and now it's third year of full-scale invasion, and the end of this war is not on the horizon. So apparently their actions are still quite weak. And sometimes I just keep thinking, what could be the strong action here? Maybe one of the things that feels like what could help would be some social disruption, social unrest within Russia. That could be maybe a turning point. What do you think about that?
I mean, yes, no. I mean, I'm of two minds. I mean, I think, I mean, at one level, I blame Russians because there's a question of is it Putin's war or is it Russia's war? And I think it's definitely both. I remember, I don't know when anybody was here when Katya Schulman was here. And she's a kind of Russian kind of quote-unquote liberal intellectual who's, anti-Putin. She's now living in Germany. And she presented to this community, which, by the way, brought out all these Russian students that I'd never seen. It was amazing. So I asked her, I said, well, Professor Schulman, I said, do you support, Western support for the Ukrainian military? And she was so angry. She didn't want to answer. She's like, well, I don't know. I'm not a military expert. I mean, I don't know whether, military assistance would help. I'm like, I'm not a military expert either, but if you have more bullets, you're going to be able to resist Russian aggression than if you have fewer bullets. At the same time, so I think someone like her, there is no excuse. She's sitting in Germany. She can say whatever she wants. I have a little bit more sympathy for Russians in Russia because, I like to think that I would be, have, the ability to speak truth to power, even though I was going to spend 10 years in jail. I don't know what I would do. I mean, it is just genuinely very costly for Russians to oppose Putin right now. And I think, but obviously the Russians, do, have culpability. Yeah.
Okay, sure. Please, white sweater.
Along those lines, would you care to speculate about what happened last year when Prigozhin came this close to getting at Putin personally, and then he decided to suddenly back off at the last minute? Do you have any idea why he would go so far and then suddenly back off?
Yeah, I mean, I think, what was interesting there is just sort of how kind of the Russian state, it was kind of much weaker than we thought. So, we don't know. Again, Russia is one of these places, because we have no information about it, we don't know internally what's going on. So, it could collapse tomorrow. That could happen. That was sort of, what could have, but of course, Prigozhin did not end well for Prigozhin. But, yeah.
Please, you had a question, second row there. Yes?
So how might the outcome of this war shape China's calculus regarding Taiwan?
I think that's a very important question. I think that people, again, when they talk about Russia's conflict in Ukraine, they don't talk enough about its global implications. And I think precisely, it's not just about Europe. It's not just when IR specialists say that Ukraine, it's not in U.S. interest. This has really global implications. Absolutely. Again, the problem is I don't know what's going on in Xi's head. No one knows. But certainly, the extent to which Russia is able to benefit from this openly imperialist act, I think the more that happens, the more that encourages China to invade Taiwan.
We have a question in the back, black sweater.
I'm going to ask you to perhaps look at the crystal ball a little bit. Let's move forward 3 months. And we assume that there is some kind of a settlement which involves some loss of Ukrainian sovereignty or territory or whatever, and there's some kind of calm. We still have 3 more years of Trump. What's going to happen? What do you see in the following year or the year after that? Does Russia continue to move? We just talked about China, does it move? What is going to happen that is going to shape the future resulting from whatever happens in terms of a settlement in Ukraine?
I think there could very well be a settlement. As I think there was this article, I think by David French today or yesterday in the New York Times that talked about the 3 wars. The question is, you could sort of have peace today, but then you're just going to have a war down the line. I very much believe that's the case. That sort of ultimately, negotiation between Russia and Ukraine and West is meaningless unless there are plausible security guarantees. And I think that is all that matters. In other words, as someone, I think it wasn't me who came up with this idea, but it said that the issue is not negotiations between Ukraine and Russia, but between Ukraine and the West. How much is the West willing to kind of provide meaningful security guarantees, which would mean things like troops on the ground, or membership in NATO, which I think is absolutely important. And I think also that the problem is that everybody says Leonid Rogozin and Trump say that we want peace. Well, without some kind of plausible security guarantee, you will never have peace.
We have a question on the side here, blue shirt. Microphone, please here first. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. I understand that the Russian economy is about the size of Canada's, and that Europe together is militarily stronger than Russia. So what is Europe afraid of?
I think that's a good question. I think that Russia at the same time has a very large population, and Russia has a lot of experience getting its population to fight when those people don't want to fight. So that is, I think that is the problem. I think it is a kind of demographic problem, and I think there is an issue of like. To get North Korea. Well, they had to get North Korea, but still, but you'll notice, at least the data I've seen, is clearly Putin does not want to bring in people from Moscow or St. Petersburg. But I think that there is a kind of demographic reality which I think makes it harder. But at the same time, all I can say in Ukraine's favor is that you look at sort of since World War II, very few imperial wars have ended up successfully for the imperial power. Just look at the number of countries, since World War II. That is all a function of the sort of failure of the imperial paradigm. And I think, ultimately Ukrainians are much more motivated to fight than the Russians. But the issue also is just that the kind of Russians have more weapons and more people. So.
Okay. Did we have a question in the back there on this side?
Thank you for your talk, Professor Way. So you've talked at length about how Western rapprochement with Russia has helped facilitate the diffusion of authoritarian norms throughout our democracies. But my question for you is, to what extent should we also be blaming homegrown factors in explaining this phenomenon, such as the role of American digital platforms in proliferating hateful ideologies and domestically perceived shortcomings of the Washington Consensus?
Yeah, so I don't actually, thanks for that question. I actually don't think that sort of diffusion from east to west is the main thing that's responsible for authoritarianism in the West. I just think that, I think there are many domestic factors in the United States which are much more important with the sort of radicalization of the Republican Party. I don't think I don't think Russian interference in the 2016 election probably mattered all that much. But it's just that I think this idea that integration only goes one direction, I think, is wrong. And I think there's sort of a lot of domestic, but there's still, I think, mostly the reasons for the breakdown of democracy in the United States are much more domestically driven than Putin.
Questions from our online
Okay, sure.
viewers. How to explain seeming paradox of so-called Western progressives and Trumpian right often agreeing on anti-Ukraine policies?
That is a great question. I think there's been a massive moral failure of the Western left. And I'll name names. So my old friend, family friend, Ron Sunni, I love him dearly. But he, I just think, or Noam Chomsky, there is something about the American left which is right on so many things, but was driven by this kind of insane anti-Americanism that it turns out was a driving force. And for them, Ukraine's biggest sin, which was not its fault, was that its ally was the United States. And so I'm like, we're discussing, and he's like, well, it's clear that Ukraine can never win the war against Russia. First of all, that is not clear at all. That is not clear at all. And frankly, I am not a military expert. You're not a military expert. And did they ever say this about Vietnam in the Vietnam War? That the Vietnamese should just give up. They never said that. So give me a break. Thanks. But yes, that pisses me off. Sorry.
Do you want another question online, or shall we go back to the audience?
We can go.
Okay, so on this side there is in the near the back there.
Hi, my name is Anurag. I'm from India. My question is, I agree with your sentiment that, I think you had the experience that you had in Pakistan about how the narrative of Russia is more prevalent and more, it resonates more with the audiences in probably South Asia or in Global South. Where I probably would push back slightly would be the fact that, a lot of people would argue that the Russia's invasion of Ukraine is not as much a breakdown of the liberal international order as much as it is an embrace of the illiberal world order. The world order, with respect to the norms of sovereignty, we can, the argument from a lot of non-Western scholars would be that there are always these double standards of the West. Even with the current ongoing Israel-Palestine war, you wouldn't sort of frame the Israel's ongoing genocide as a breakdown of liberal order, but you would sort of talk about Russian invasion of Ukraine in a particular way, in a particular narrative. So how would you respond to this criticism?
Yeah, no, I think, thank you again for a great question. I don't mean to present a kind of overly simple, idealized view of the liberal world order. It certainly was contradictory. I was more, vehemently against U.S. invasion of Iraq. I think there's sort of, one is even, I think there's a kind of double standard with regard to Palestine. I very much see that. So kind of a Palestinian exception to human rights. Very much agree. Nonetheless, warts and all, the liberal order was so much better than what you have, this kind of old-style, unadulterated Russian imperialism. And the U.S., I never thought that U.S. should have gone to Iraq, but the U.S. never took over Iraq as part of its, the 51st state. And so there is a difference, right? Even given the flaws of the world order. And I think partly, I had discussions with my Pakistani students, and they were like, well, the partition was much more violent, which is incredibly violent. But has anybody seen pictures of Mariupol? And yeah, it's all bad, but the kind of, I think there sort of is a kind of lack of information, and a kind of everything's kind of seen through a view of kind of anti-Americanism, which colors both the American left's, as well as the sort of global South view of Ukraine.
I can have
online
another question. Yes, it's actually a very, very difficult one. but it hints at sort of the position of Zelensky and the limits of his powers. What would you advise President Zelensky to do to get a reasonable peace plan that maintains Ukraine's independence both internally and internationally?
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's all about Trump. I mean, the issue, again, you know, Europeans have tried various, clearly sort of arguing with Trump, you know, is pointless. And you sort of see the Europeans say really unctuous things to Trump, you know, in praise, and, you know, people have, I mean, the 28-point plan was, you know, literally translated from Russian. But what choice do they have? As long as the United States remains overwhelmingly military power, you know, you have to sort of kind of accommodate to that. And they're just, the room for maneuver is very small. One thing I will say, again, I want to answer questions that no one asked about elections in Ukraine. I mean, I think that that Zelensky is absolutely right to delay elections. My concern, because, you know, in this kind of security environment, is, you know, having free and fair elections is basically impossible. But the truth is that the war is going to go on for a very long time. And so I do wonder whether it might make sense on the Ukrainian side to develop and think about ways of having an election in the context of war, even though I completely believe it's okay that they don't have an election. But I think that there is a kind of danger in the kind of, you know, right now, the absence of kind of elite turnover.
Do we have any other questions? Yes, please. Here in the front. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the lecture. My name is Karolina Koziura. I'm a postdoctoral fellow here at the Monk School. I have plenty of questions, but these were like already plenty of questions asked. I would like to kind of push the argument of, you know, the perception of the war from other parts of the world, right? Because, you know, you have a very strong argument as, you know, this war as you know, the end of this Western liberal world order. But then it was also like very Western liberal world order, you know, perspective on the war, right? So I'm like, you know, wondering again, if we think about Latin America, if we think, you know, about parts of Asia, China, India, whether, you know, whether from perspective of these countries, this is also like such a significant event. Whether this is also such a significant event. I mean, the war in Ukraine, right? Because like I remember when you know, the full-scale invasion of Russia, full-scale invasion of Ukraine started. I mean, like many of my colleagues from India would say, like, oh, this is just like yet another war in Europe. Like, why should we care, right? So like, you know, a little bit about, you know, whether they also think about, maybe this should be the question, right? Whether they also think about this war as some kind of end of a particular world order. So this would be, you know, one question. And the other, I don't know, the other question would be about Western Europe, right? So is there some light here or not really, right? Because like I spent like 2 years in Western Europe, and I participated in like many serious discussions about like what should Europe do, right? Because like it understands that, you know, okay, like United States is no longer the partner, right? So should we have like an army, right? Like should we how should Europe respond to the conflict, right? So yeah, so is there like any light here that something is going to happen in Europe that, you know, like Western Europe will become like a stronger kind of partner in all this conversation? Or do you think that, no, this is actually the end of this era where Europe actually matters internationally, right?
Yeah, I mean,
thank you.
First of all, I don't think it's the end. I think, you know, I think I'm encouraged by European efforts to build up its military, and it's just that it takes time. And the problem is that Ukraine right now is suffering enormous amounts of damage, and it's just very hard in a quick turnaround to replace the American military-industrial complex. But I do expect that given, Europe is not a poor set of countries. They're wealthy. As I think someone mentioned, they can do it. They just have to decide to do it. And I think this will be probably one of those important historical inflection points, which will force us. I mean, it's hard to imagine a worse leader than Trump, right? But at the same time, it was also unhealthy for both Canada and Europe to be so reliant on the United States. In some ways, I think that there could be sort of healthy, reaction. So I'm, my sister, who's kind of classic liberal New Yorker, is horrified. I'm like a big fan of the military-industrial complex. She's like, "What's happened to my brother?" I'm like, "Well, because you live in the United States, you never have to worry about being invaded." That's sort of, it's great power privilege. We talk about white privilege. There's also great power privilege that you're sitting in San Francisco or New York, you don't have to worry about being invaded. And we don't think we have as much of this worry here, but that is, that we're in a much more vulnerable position. So we do have to, do things like worry about building up the military-industrial complex. So your question about the global South, can you just reiterate it?
I think, well, I don't know. I think that, for us in this room, right, it's kind of very obvious how important this war is, right? How this war really kind of changed. It's like it has tremendous, horrible consequences in Ukraine. I mean, in Europe, it's quite obvious, how important this war is. But I'm wondering, okay, what about, Latin America? What about India? What about China, right? Do they kind of, what's their kind of take of, it's not about, you already answered about the questions of Russian imperialism, right? But I'm just wondering whether they have such, whether they kind of consider this war as important as we, for example, think about it in Europe, because, it is in Europe, or, or we think about it here, no?
Yeah, so I think that's a good question. I think part of, my answer would be that I think the liberal world order was, again, you had a lot of words, was not perfect, but was a world in which countries did not regularly invade one another for territorial gain, which benefited everyone, right? I mean, I think, looking back to early modern history, when countries were literally at war most of the time, right? That is not a world that anybody of us want to live in, whether you're Ethiopia or Eritrea or Ecuador or whatever, right? I mean, I don't think any of us want to live in a world, even in the global South, where we have to invest huge percentages of our GDP to national defense. But that is simply the reality, and I think that is so. In a sense, I think part of, the problem is that people don't fully understand the broader implications way beyond Europe and Ukraine for Russia's invasion. And that's why I think, as I emphasized in the last slide, if Russia gets away with it, it will most of all hurt Ukraine, but also augur a kind of a new, much more violent world order that will harm everyone. Not even if you're not under direct threat of invasion by Putin, because it kind of opens up the Pandora's box. So, but the problem is that it's like in the United States with authoritarianism. People just have very poor imagination, right? It's hard for them to sort of imagine, because they're used to, the United States, they've had democracy all your life, and you're suddenly like, oh my God, there's no democracy. You can't, but people have to have a little bit of imagination. You have to sort of lay it out. But I think there is a reason why Russia's invasion of Ukraine has implications globally.
Any other questions? Please, in the front.
Slightly different question to you. Are you worried about Germany? They are starting building the very strong military. And it's not so long ago that World War II and World War I was ended.
Right. So that, of course, has been, there was a lot of resistance within Germany, I think, to military expansion because of the memories of World War II. I, however, do not believe in kind of national character. I do not think that I do not think that somehow, I think the threat of the downside of Germany not building up a military to respond to the Russian threat is much greater than any potential downside of kind of repetition of World War I, World War II. I think that's much more of an immediate danger. But yeah.
Any other questions online?
Well, maybe one more, and it is regarding the history of China losing territory to Tsarist Russia by means of unequal treaties. And don't Chinese maps still show these areas as being Chinese? And probably the question is, could this not play in the Chinese-Russian relations current? The territorial, the Chinese
territory back from Russia?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. That could be the case. I do think that the Chinese position is a little bit different because it benefits in a way from the liberal world order that that Russia does not because of trade. So I do wonder whether that does give me some sort of ray of hope, because I think that first of all, I think if China invaded Taiwan, the Taiwanese, it's interesting. There really is a parallel between Taiwan now and Ukraine before the invasion. If you read about Taiwan, they talk about how it's divided, it's sort of pro-Chinese, pro-Taiwan. But my guess, the minute China actually tries to invade, Taiwan will become incredibly unified, like Ukraine did. And so I think it would not be easy for China to successfully invade Taiwan.
But since we are on the topic of China, I wanted to actually ask a question. What do you see China's role in the continuation of the war in Ukraine? To what extent China is one of the main actors in the fact that the war still goes on?
Absolutely, big role. Yeah, it's funny. I was weirdly asked to breakfast by the Chinese ambassador. I'm like a lowly professor, and I was like, and so I just let him talk. But I said, why don't you? This would be China's great role. China is the one power. It would be in addition to the United States. The United States could militarily defeat Russia, but if China chose to shut off Russia, I think it could sort of have potentially end the war. So I agree with that, but it's decided not to.
Like why they don't?
Yeah, I think that they think that if it did, it would strengthen the West, and so it doesn't want to do that. It would be seen, rightly or wrongly, as a victory of the United States and Europe. So I think they see this in zero-sum terms of that. So they kind of like a situation in which no one kind of is winning, right? So that's my guess.
There's a question there on the side. Oh, yes. Okay, first and then you. Thank you.
Thank you. Lucan, I really appreciate also your enthusiasm and also personal views, and I thought you were going to stand up and bang the desk on some of the points there. So I like that.
I almost took off my shoe.
Thank you for that particular reference. In some ways, it seems to be a war of attrition with all these things that are being talked about in the discussion and in the very fruitful Q&A. Where do you see the vulnerabilities of Ukraine continuing to participate in this war? And at what point do you think that maybe it could collapse or the tide could really turn against it? Or vice versa, dealing with the Russians, whether with further sanctions or various things, public pushback in Russia, whatever it might be, that where would Russia be vulnerable? Maybe, we can't continue this and be willing to cave in. Do you see anything on any of those fronts?
Right, so the thing is, the reason why I think the war is going to go on for a very long time is that it's really hard to imagine I mean, Ukraine ever giving up? I think ultimately, there is the sort of really dark possibility. The way Russia wins wars, which I guess it could still do, is they just simply literally bomb cities out of existence, and then they basically take over the sort of empty shell, which is what you saw in Grozny, what you saw in Mariupol. I think here, I do think that probably Europe plays a role in kind of preventing that from happening, but that is certainly a possibility. Otherwise, I don't see, Zelensky, no Zelensky. I like Zelensky as much as the next guy, but it was really the entire Ukrainian population that mobilized against Russia in early 2022. If anything, Zelensky, by failing to take the war seriously, because he didn't actually think that Russia would invade, that was a mistake. But it was kind of the spontaneous kind of, ground up militarization of Ukrainian society that occurred in early parts of 2022 that prevented, Russia's victory. So I think, and so I think it's just hard to imagine, Ukraine ever completely just, in the era of modern nationalism, it's just very hard to win imperial wars. So I just don't see that happening. But that could involve a lot of death. But I just don't see that happening. But also at the same time, as long as Putin is alive, given how much kind of a personal stake he has, I think he could. I don't think he'd lose power if he left. But clearly, there aren't many checks on his power, and it just doesn't seem like. This is where I kind of disagree with some of the analysis. I think people say, well, would it really matter whether Putin was in power or somebody else? I think it would, because Putin has his kind of stake in his whole kind of historical reputation resting on his success in Ukraine. But if it were some other awful Russian who were in charge of Russia, they wouldn't have that kind of need to defend that policy. And so I think they probably would be better for Ukraine.
Professor, no? No? Do we have any other questions? Yes, please.
Hello. I'm Leila, I'm from Georgia, and my question is concerning to Georgia. What do you think the security threats this war brings to Georgia right now, especially in particular, what different scenarios how this war ends? Is there a chances that Russia will expand its aggression towards Georgia and post-Soviet Union countries? And if so, what the Western society do to avoid this? Especially we already had the war with Russia in 2008, and the 20% of the country is still under occupation.
Yeah, I think here that Ukraine has given a huge service to other post-Soviet countries because it's bogged Russia down in this war. So I think if anything, this invasion has probably kind of restricted Russia's ability to engage in other parts of the former Soviet Union. So, I think in that sense, this is like the most sliverest of a kind of silver lining is that sort of, in the same way that Vietnam kind of bogged down American power, this is sort of, it makes it, it's dramatically weakened the geopolitical power of Russia, both in the former Soviet Union and generally, because, it has to invest all of its resources in this war. So in some ways, just sort of my gut reaction, because I haven't really thought about the question, is probably in some ways helped Georgia a little bit, in the sense that kind of Putin doesn't have the energy or resources to engage in other types of imperial behavior.
I would ask one question.
Yes.
You said about President Trump's sort of fondness for strongmen. And you know that his sort of favorite line toward Zelensky and Ukraine is, you don't have the cards. So he doesn't think Ukraine, Zelensky are strong? Or is that like a psychological game he's playing there?
The problem with Zelensky is he's not enough of a dictator. So I think that is, I think by strongman, I mean,
Because he also likes winners, right? He'll.
yeah, I guess, yeah. There was also the kind of weird, that weird interview between Mamdani and Trump. I mean, yeah, no, but I think, you know, Trump thinks of, you know, likes, you know, I think, you know, would prefer to be a personalist dictator, and that's certainly clearly what he's trying to do now. And I think, I guess the question, I mean, I think the kind of Trump's relationship to Russia has always been sort of a mystery. You know, I mean, given how much he was able, basically, he's been fairly consistently pro-Russia. I mean, not all the time, but the vast majority of the time. So the question is, you know, what's behind that? Is it some sort of blackmail? Is it some sort of, you know, buying off and the like? And I guess my feeling is that it's much more about he has a normative preference for dictatorships, and so he likes Kim Il-sung, you know, Kim Jong-un, and others. And you know, the problem with Dylynsky is that he's a democratic leader. So I mean, but
Well, I think Ukraine might surprise him. So.
yeah, yeah. No, I definitely think that yeah, Ukraine has a lot of cards.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Professor Lucan Way, for this very vibrant and thought-provoking lecture and the discussion and all of the great questions that we had from our attendees here on site and online. I would also like to thank the co-organizers of this event, the Petro Jacek's Program for the Study of Ukraine and the Center for European and Eurasian Studies, and especially point people Olga Kisarchuk, Tanya Mechta, and Ksenia Kibuzinski. And we are also grateful to the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto for hosting this lecture at the Campbell Conference Facility here, and to the technical and front of house teams for your expert assistance. Thank you. And finally, I would like to thank all of our attendees on site and online for coming to this lecture. It was really great. Thank you so much. And by the way, this lecture will be later published on YouTube under the handles CEES at Monk and Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies. I now invite our offline attendees to join us in the next room for a reception catered by Acacia Cafe. Thank you. Thank you very much.